Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's programme all about the built environment. I'm your host, Andrew Tuck. Coming up,
a lot of times we talk about sea defences and sea walls and sea barriers. And if they're designed with that idea that they can double up as pieces of public realm, they can definitely not feel like sea defences. You know, they can feel like completely natural promenades and edges that help you get closer to the water and enjoy it.
How can good design affect our cities beyond the aesthetic? Today we take in two stories which exemplify the principle that thoughtful and beautiful design can have a deeper impact on a space than just being pleasant to look at. We head to the coast of England, where the design for a seafront redevelopment is incorporating climate resiliency and neighbourhood regeneration in its plans. And we hop the Atlantic to New York to find out how strategic design interventions on the city's subway system go hand in hand with behavioural science and public safety. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Andrew Tuck. First up today, we assess how coastal settlements can improve their seaside offerings while also protecting against rising sea levels and other climate-related challenges that they will face in their future. Duarte Lobo Antunes is the director of A is for Architecture, a team based in London that's working on residential, commercial and cultural projects around the UK and Europe. One such project is in Folkestone, a seaside town on the south coast of England. The Folkestone Seafront Master Plan, which has recently received planning permission, will include 405 homes, public spaces and independent retail, all the while strengthening the area against climate-related challenges. The team is also hoping that the project will influence the future plans for other UK seaside towns. Monocle's Carlotta Rebello recently spoke with Duarte in our studio, and she began by asking, as it stands, how well prepared seaside settlements are in the UK in terms of protecting against flooding and sea level rises.
Well, I think it probably varies from town to town and from coastal community to coastal community. I think in general, I would say we're probably not very well prepared for climate change and for rising sea levels. But I also think that retreating is not the best option. And so I think in Folkestone in particular, I think a lot of effort was put into improving sea defences and raising the profile of the beach, for example. There's going to be a new revetment wall to protect the harbour. And the developments in general can help fund this type of infrastructure, which is quite expensive. And so I think while we're not super well prepared necessarily, I think that there are efforts that one can make, and some coastal communities definitely are making, to not only make seaside towns more livable in general, but also to protect them from the potential of flood and rising sea levels.
And it's interesting the case of Folkestone because the water, the harbour, has been so deeply connected with its development and its history. Mm-hmm. And when we look at the plans here, it is bringing a whole new community closer to the sea line. What are some of the challenges that presents? Because, of course, climate change is happening, the water levels are rising. So what are some of the challenges that presents when you're trying to, at the same time, bring people closer to the waterfront?
Yeah, I think the history of coastal communities and their relationship to the water is actually quite varied and in a lot of ways quite problematic. And I think when you look at UK towns and cities, Folkestone is not actually a city, but that could be said of, Southampton and Bournemouth and other big coastal communities, that they don't have a great relationship to the water's edge. A lot of times it's quite privatized. It either belongs to like a ferry company or it's a commercial port, and it's not necessarily a place that people can promenade on or can enjoy. And I think the difference with the Folkestone seafront development was that it really turns something that was, in its historic past, quite private. It was used by people to an extent, particularly the port, as a transportation hub. It's where you got the ferry to Boulogne, for example. And the seafront itself with kind of amusement parks and all the attractions there. But the water's edge itself was somehow, it had a barrier towards it, right? And so I think that the first kind of challenge is to reconnect local communities with the water's edge, not just as a kind of a view from afar, but actually something that you can experience much closer in a fairly casual way. The other characteristic, I think, of the British seaside is that it, even though it was always kind of a place for the sort of weird and wonderful and a place of exception, it was also a place where you interacted with the seafront in almost prescribed ways, through the pier or through the amusement arcade, but not in a kind of a natural, daily, relaxed way. So the first barrier, I think, is psychological, and it's kind of changing people's approach to being at the water's edge. But then obviously there's a lot of physical challenges as well. So rising sea levels is one of them. It's expensive. It's more expensive to build close to the water than it is a lot of times to build inland. And also, because of the industry and because of all the other things we mentioned, sometimes this land is contaminated. Sometimes this land needs a lot of work to make it fit for other uses. So, I think we have various different challenges building close to the water's edge, but none of them is completely insurmountable. And if one thinks about the potential that the water's edge has, both in terms of quality of life, but also in terms of value in a lot of ways to developers, which is also, it is an ingredient that's important, then I think the equation is there to make these places work.
What are some of the, particularities of the negotiation that needs to happen when you think about delivering public spaces and increasing public amenities, but you then have almost the engineering side of things of creating a more resilient seafront, of mitigating against the climate challenges? How does that go hand in hand with then delivering public areas too?
I think it goes very well hand in hand. For example, you take the harbour arm in Folkestone, which has become really a destination, not only in Kent, but, farther afield. A lot of people come from London and even further to go to the harbour arm. That wasn't a pleasure pier, that was a piece of infrastructure to protect the harbour. And we see that so many times in different places, in the Docklands in London, for example, which were, again, not necessarily built for people's enjoyment, but they do have that potential. And these are things that can be combined quite easily. So a lot of times we talk about sea defenses and sea walls and sea barriers. And if they're designed with that idea that they can double up as pieces of public realm, then they can definitely not feel like sea defenses. They can feel like completely natural promenades and piers and edges that help you get closer to the water and enjoy it.
Well, it's funny because at the end of the day, it's about combining the utilitarian mission of these projects. It has a goal, which is to protect the city, the town, with and also the beautiful side. We know that beautiful architecture, beautiful design has a powerful influence on people. It can make us healthier, happier, more connected to our communities. But what you're saying, I guess, is that one doesn't exclude the other.
No, absolutely not. I think there's various different interesting ingredients that one can bring to seaside communities when it comes to design and architecture, right? So one of them has to do with this kind of seafaring, industrial, sea defense, infrastructure and heritage, which is a huge attractor, and also it's a huge theme, and it's something that really is helpful for us as architects and designers to kind of build our design narratives around. And I think there's a lot of potential in this kind of seaside industrial heritage and infrastructural heritage. But then also, this is something that, for example, in the Folkestone project was quite clear, is this idea that some of the urban rules that guide developments, further inland don't really apply when you get right on the water's edge. You don't have this grid that can expand in different directions. You're faced with the contours of the coast and the difference in levels, and that really brings out the opportunity to have a different design language, which isn't necessarily the same you would use elsewhere. So, for example, for our harbour plan, there was a little bit of controversy around the design and the boldness of the design. But we really felt that that design wasn't bold because we necessarily thought that a design needs to be like that. It was because it was really contextual, right? And so things like, for example, protecting from winds, protecting, things like balconies and terraces from the wind. And the wind in the coast can be quite strong, particularly kind of in the English Channel. So that's a factor that's perhaps different from other places. But also sun shading, because we're also, experiencing climate change and temperatures are getting hotter. And so we need to protect homes and buildings from the direct effects of the sun and from overheating, much more than perhaps before. And so all of these things, plus the exceptionality of building close to the coast where we're favoring views above other things, really generates an architecture that can by itself be interesting, even if you're just using quite objective parameters to create it.
How did the community take it? Because we know with a lot of these projects, well, with the vast majority of projects, community engagement is key, not only to make sure you are delivering something that will work, but, to get the views of the people that have lived in the area for years. You alluded there to a bit of controversy. Did they understand what you're proposing here? How was that process?
I mean, that's always a tricky subject, whatever the development. And I think it's very much tied to the way the planning system works in the UK. And actually, after we finally got planning earlier this year, we've started kind of hearing back from the community in a slightly different way, and different voices have come out. So there was definitely a lot of opposition to the plans. These plans aren't necessarily recent. The outline planning, which kind of established the development, is from 2015, and it was quite popular at the time because Folkestone was perhaps seen as being a bit more on its knees than it is now, because now there's this feeling of regeneration that happened because of other things, because of the creative quarter, because of the sports scene, because of a lot of things. And so maybe people don't really relate a lot of the regeneration that happened in other sectors to this residential development. So I think that was part of the problem. But also, well, first of all, I mean, we listened quite intently to what people said throughout the community engagement process, but even what they said with the way they used the seafront, right? So one of the things that we made sure to include in the plans of the future development was all of these meanwhile uses that were being quite successful in the site at the moment, really make them permanent, give them a year-round kind of home, right? And that wasn't necessarily in the original plans, and that came because people really embraced the harbour as a destination and as a place of leisure, right? So that's definitely one of the ways that the plans changed to kind of be closer to the way the community were using those spaces. But I also think that a lot of the issues surrounding perhaps people not being so happy with the way that the harbour and the seafront is changing has to do with something that I think is quite particular to seaside communities, which is this idea of a certain nostalgia for a past that was seen as better than the present in a way. And I think that has to do with the fact that a lot of these places were really tourist destinations, and people remember a heyday where the town was bustling, etc. But they seem to forget that not only was that very much a seasonal thing, and that's always a problem for seaside communities, even in Portugal, where we're both from, we know that, the more a community is dependent on tourism and the more it's seen as a seaside destination rather than just like a town or a city that happens to be on the coast, the more it struggles with economic activity, off season. So people forget that, those bright, sunny days in the summer were, first of all, there weren't quite many, and then they had a kind of a long off season where towns were empty and, they were really struggling. So I think there's a sense of nostalgia that really, especially for some of the older residents, really makes it hard for them to accept that seaside towns, in a lot of cases, need to find a new purpose, and that new economic purpose, in my opinion, I think that is very much what Folkestone is trying to do, is to try to be less monocultural, right? Less dependent on either tourism or the fact that it's a port town, fishing. I mean, fishing has almost disappeared. It's now almost like, particularly from Folkestone, it's almost a bit of a cottage industry at the moment. And it used to be quite a big thing. Be less dependent on these single kind of economic activities and be more like every other town, where you have a growing population, where young people want to stay, where you have sports and arts and culture and good schools and interesting neighborhoods, interesting places to live and destinations, and also good transport links. I think one of the things that's really maybe sets Folkestone apart from other examples in the South Coast is the fact that it's so well connected to London. So if one can kind of accept that coastal communities will find a purpose that's not necessarily what they've been in the past, then I think it makes it easier for people to understand, the purpose behind some of these things.
My thanks there to Duarte Lobo Antunes in conversation with Carlotta Rebello. Next, we head to New York, where the city's subway system is often perceived as crime-riddled and dangerous. While it may be asking a lot for even the best designs to stop crime, they can influence things like how visible we feel on platforms and in carriages, which can in turn deter criminals and make spaces feel safer. So what smart design choices can be made to bring about a safer and calmer transit experience? The research firm Vital City recently released recommendations on reducing crime and disorder in New York City's subways. And Claire Wise, principal of design firm WXY, was a contributor to the study. The findings showed that behaviours change when people can physically see themselves and are more aware of their presence in a space. This can influence not only behaviour of subway riders, but also their feelings of safety too. Carlotta Ribello recently spoke with Claire, and Carlotta began by asking about the scale of the crime problem in New York's subway system and why it was necessary to conduct this research.
New York City, one of its most popular public systems is the New York subway, and it works 24 hours a day. Now, that's actually one of the important things about it because people can rely on it. If they have a job, they have the night shift, they can rely on it. If they're leaving early for an appointment, they can rely on it. One of the problems with it is that when do you clean subway cars? How do you prevent people from living on subway cars? And a lot of our system needs repair and maintenance. So I think that sort of frames it, I hope. It's every borough. We now have ferries on top of it that are at the same rate as the subway, but really the subway system kind of stands alone as the major way New Yorkers get around. And during the pandemic, a lot of them saw things on the subway or experienced things that made them not want to be on the subway. And so ridership also dropped.
And those numbers really haven't recovered since. And the numbers say as well that for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the type of crime happening on the subway in transit has changed from robberies, so crimes mostly driven by economic, monetary means, to felony assault. So it's a different type of violence that's been emerging on the subway. And what I found interesting here is this idea that design and behavioral science can go hand in hand to help shape the way we feel safe in spaces like this and to kind of almost help course correct some of the behavior. So perhaps I'll start precisely with that. How do you even begin to design for something that is as intangible as this notion of perceived safety?
It's such an interesting question because you could ask yourselves, isn't it mostly policy? Don't we need more rules? Or should the subways be free? And wouldn't that do it? So I think absolutely there are issues by which the rules we live by, and then also an educational level, they're important. But without a kind of designed environment, how do people know exactly how things are going to work? And so I think there is a big role. This is a design problem, whether it's engineering, architecture, that behavioral scientists are starting to look much more at the built environment and its effects on people. So, we talked a lot about one of the biggest realizations that came out of the pandemic was the need for people to address mental health crises, whether it was on a scale of personal therapy and access to mental health resources, or on a city scale where we needed policies to find places for people to get help. So just looking at that tells you that there's something about our environments that can provide triggers for people along the neurodiverse spectrum, but also people that are in stress.
And a lot of the recommendations, which I found interesting, they, in theory, seem like really simple, of course, clever, but simple solutions. Improve lighting to reduce shadows, for example, enhance, maximize sight lines. When I was reading through them, it is funny because a lot of these things come across as, oh yeah, that makes sense. So obvious. Why do you think it wasn't obvious and there was a need indeed to come up with these more human-centric design approaches to design safety?
One of the reasons is that for many, many years, when people were only concerned with literally getting the trains to run on time and collecting garbage and cleaning graffiti off the trains, in a sense, for the system and the platforms that already existed, people treated them like the plumbing system of the city, almost like a kind of sewer system. They didn't think the aesthetics of the system. And then on the news stations, in New York in particular, really the art versus making architectural improvements was seen as the way to, I would call, humanize the system and create a sense of people being in a space that was invested in. Now, I think one of the problems with that is that it doesn't address some of the things that we even see in parking garage design. If you don't see around the corners, there's a good chance that someone's going to hit you. And this is sort of where I get into that there's techniques in other places that are about making sure you have a 360-degree view, making spaces feel larger rather than smaller, that could be applied to the subways to great effect, because every station in New York is different. And again, because it's the legacy of how we get in and out of stations, all the existing vaults, all the different stairs to different buildings, that gives us a lot of blind corners in our system.
Do you feel like it is possible to, through design, through these approaches, to transform the way people feel in general about traveling on the New York subway? You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, the drop in numbers of passengers traveling and how it really hasn't recovered since the pandemic, where we saw that number really go down. Could design be part of the solution to bring people back to the subway system?
I think the good news coming out of what we're seeing for congestion pricing is that the ease by which people use the car instead of getting on the subway is lessening. And there's a motive now for people to get back. There's also, because of the return to office policies in many companies, actually all the ridership is climbing. But you want not only the ridership to climb, but the reputation of the subway, I think, to continue to improve. So I think a lot of the lessons out of hospitality, let's say even restaurant design, where you can go into a restaurant and it feels claustrophobic, or you're there by yourself and you don't really feel like it's a pleasant place to be. There's techniques, there's interior design techniques about how you use mirrors in hospitality spaces, in particular in restaurants, that allow you to use less light. It magnifies the light, because too much light, you feel surveilled instead of able to see others. And reflective surfaces can really help with that. You want to be able to see to the end of the platform. You want to avoid dead ends in platforms. And I think that we haven't done enough in the design, or even applying on top of the subways we already have, design ideas like reflective surfaces, like lights that are non-glary, but give you more of an ambient that then can be reflected. And also even things like convex mirrors, like you see in parking garages, that would allow you to see around corners. I think all of these things, and a redesign of the platforms themselves to be more readable if you're blind, if you have other disabilities, and less narrow entrances onto the platform would help users in the system a lot.
It's interesting to hear how so many of these examples can be taken from other industries, other buildings, other types of sectors, and it's all about really finding what works and where. And in this particular case of the subway, it is quite a complex, high traffic environment. I wonder if there's room for any experimentation. Are you able to try out new things, some of these tactical urbanism approaches that you've been describing in a place that is so densely populated and there's such a high intensity traffic area at all times?
I have high hopes, because a number of the environmental scientists working in various cities do a kind of study through piloting. And as more and more people get back to the subway and it becomes clearer that we have to go beyond multi and hundreds of millions of dollars on single projects and start kind of creating more lessons from tactical urbanism and more lessons from public space design into our public system called the subway, then I think that maybe as a way of seeing effects, we could look at funding streams for doing much more of these experiments in the subway itself. And I think New York City would be a great place to study.
And Claire, of course, with your work at WXY, there's a lot of focus on this, place-based approach to design, putting humans at the center of a lot of the work you do. So I really wanted to end on a question that talks about this, because essentially what we're talking about here is restoring trust in shared public spaces, in this specific case, the New York subway. So do you think that we are observing a wider cultural shift towards valuing design and human-centric design as a tool for civic well-being, for creating better cities that put people first?
Well, I think we're in a time period where various examples of walkable cities and projects like the High Line and projects like various parks all over the world that we're welcoming way more people and more connected actually to their downtowns and walkable districts have shown that, in fact, people want to get away from the scare of being hit by cars. And that, as convenient as cars are, they in fact separate people from each other. And the separation that people experience from 2020 to 2023, we're still paying a price for. So like other things we're doing around the wellness issues, I think public space is a wellness issue. And then more and more, the necessity of finding ways for people to get outside, to interact with people that they don't know, to kind of make good on the fact that cities are highly productive and important places for human beings, and to make them focused on making them good places for even experiencing nature in cities is important. And that's why, like, when I'm taking it back to the subway, right now we have a system that does not look at the place around the stairs or the elevators to subways as important. And I think that it's going to dawn on people that they need to treat subways and subway entrances like the important public plaza that it is. The couple of places where there is plazas, like in Times Square or in Astor Place, one of our projects associated with getting onto a subway, those are much easier places to meet someone. And more, those are the places that restaurants are going to do better, and small markets are going to do better when they're at a place even like Union Square that's associated with a public space.
Claire Wise there, speaking with Monocle's Carlotta Rebello. And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. You can follow us for new editions of the show every week, and you can subscribe to Monocle magazine for reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism too. Just visit monocle.com. The Urbanist is produced by Carlotta Rebello and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. I'm Andrew Tuck. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, city lovers.
On The Urbanist, we're always asking what makes a city truly livable. This September, find some answers in Barcelona as Monocle hosts its annual Quality of Life conference. 3 days of panels, ideas and good conversation with global mayors, architects and policy pioneers, all over good food and a glass of something local. Find out more and book your seat at monocle.com/conference.